And you just have to wonder what was going through the minds of these two men, and how would you ever think that something like that is something you could get away with?
We are now learning more details in the murder of 12-year-old Jocelyn Nungaray, whose body was found in a Texas valley just hours after she snuck out of her home. Investigators now say the suspects, undocumented migrants who allegedly sexually assaulted and strangled the preteen, were working to flee the country in the days following her murder.
We have gotten into Martinez-Rangel's phone and found evidence that he was searching for ways to leave the country.
We're taking a closer look at the timeline leading up to Jocelyn's death and the intense investigation that followed.
And it seems like such a brutal offense. It's just a very, very heartbreaking type of case.
The case begins on Sunday, June 16th in Houston, Texas. At about 10 o'clock that night, 12-year-old Jocelyn and her 5-year-old brother went to bed. But about 2 hours later, around midnight, Jocelyn snuck out. Her body was found 6 hours after that in a shallow creek. Criminal defense attorney Mike Korabanek says the facts of this case are shocking.
It's such a horrific type of case if everything that proves that this is what occurred. The very fact that, it's a 12-year-old girl who's snuck out of her house and is met in a store by two people who are on release for being illegally in this country, and they're on release.
After Jocelyn's body was recovered, Houston officials retraced her steps and put together a timeline leading up to her murder. After she snuck out, Jocelyn was seen in the early morning hours of Monday, June 17th, at a 7-Eleven convenience store with two men. Jocelyn's mother told investigators she did not recognize the men and believes Jocelyn didn't know them either.
She had such a bright future ahead of her, and I knew she was going to go very far. And, these monsters took that opportunity from her, from our family, of watching her.
Texas officials say the men were first caught on security cameras at a restaurant. At the time, they were seen without Jocelyn.
We have found and learned that the suspects began their evening at a Northborough area restaurant together. They left that restaurant on foot, southbound. The suspects continued south and were first seen on a camera.
But the next time they were caught on camera, Jocelyn was with them.
Suspects seen meeting the victim and talking for a few minutes while they were on Kirkendall. Later, the suspects and the victim walked together to a convenience store.
The question on everyone's mind right now is why? Why did this happen? What would be the motive? This 12-year-old girl was just going to 7-Eleven, and then she ends up murdered. So how important is it for investigators to zero in on why this might have happened?
Well, it's extremely important because number one is they're going to want to find out what exactly was the relationship here. Was it? Right now they're assuming it was not connected in any way. They randomly met in this store, but I think there has to be a little more investigation. And you just have to wonder what was going through the minds of these two men if they in fact performed these actions that caused her murder, as to why they did it, and how would you ever think that something like that is something you could get away with. And it's also interesting because these gentlemen were about 10 years older than her. So it's not like it was something where it happened with a bunch of friends, maybe they got drunk, high, or whatever, and lost control of themselves. And it's going to be very interesting to see if they did any tests on the alleged defendants in this matter, who my understanding is now are being held incarcerated pending this case, especially since they were on release from immigration, as I understand, when this occurred. And you've got to wonder what they were thinking if they were here and on release, that something like this could be something you get away with.
During her trip to 7-Eleven, Jocelyn was on the phone with her 13-year-old boyfriend. He told police he overheard her speaking with the two men. Investigators are now revealing what the young boy may have overheard. These two men allegedly went up to this 12-year-old girl and asked her for directions. This jumps right back to when I was a kid when they said stranger danger. If an adult you don't know reaches out about directions, turn the other way. So it's almost like these are stereotypical things that these two alleged suspects here are doing in order to lure this little girl away from the 7-Eleven and away from all the security cameras to murder her. What do you make of all of that?
Well, that very well could be. And also the fact is that you have to wonder if they realized she was a 12-year-old child and that this 12-year-old child had no supervision when she was at the store, and they figured we could do whatever we want. That would take a pretty sick mind to carry that out. But that very well could be what happened here.
Shortly after the trio is seen on camera at 7-Eleven, they're then seen leaving, heading toward a nearby bridge.
After a few minutes, all three together walked to a bridge where ultimately Jocelyn was murdered.
According to court documents, the suspects violated Jocelyn near this bridge for hours before killing her. They later threw her body in the nearby bayou. When Jocelyn's body was recovered, she wasn't wearing pants. There's no security video of this that we know of, but we do know the suspects were caught on camera after they allegedly committed the crime.
Suspects continue south towards their residence after leaving Jocelyn there.
One day after Jocelyn's body was recovered on Tuesday, June 18th, investigators released these images asking the public if they recognized the men.
We were able to find video and trace the movements of our suspects and of Jocelyn, and all the way to the point of where she was murdered and left in a bayou in the water.
By Wednesday, June 19th, the persons of interest were identified as 21-year-old Johan Jose Rangel Martinez and 26-year-old Franklin Jose Pena Ramos. The next day, on Thursday, June 20th, both suspects were arrested.
The suspects are now facing charges of capital murder, one being Johan Jose Rangel Martinez, the second male being Franklin Jose Pena Ramos.
We've since learned that Houston police and SWAT team members arrived at the suspect's apartment complex at about 4 hours in the morning. They called out to the suspects on a loudspeaker, but they didn't come out. That's when officials approached their apartment on the second floor, and at this point, one of the suspects even tried to jump from the balcony. Basically, these two men were trying to evade arrest. Eventually, they were taken into custody. Could any of those things be brought in as part of the case? I guess that these two men were trying to escape when the SWAT team arrived.
Yeah, it could be admissible if they prove that all they have to prove is that they should have been aware that it was law enforcement, they were ordered, and then they tried to elude police. Eluding police is a criminal statute. That's a criminal violation if you elude the police. And when you use the word that they were there with the SWAT team, I mean, it's pretty tough not to know that the SWAT team isn't law enforcement when they come, because they usually have police on their shirts, things of that nature, weapons out. So the very fact that someone ran could be an eluding of police.
When he was taken into custody, investigators noticed something curious on Martinez-Rangel's arms. There are also reports that one of the suspects has scratches up and down his arms, almost as if somebody was trying to defend themselves. Is that something that investigators would also take pictures of and note for the prosecution?
Absolutely, and they would also go look at the person who was murdered, check their fingernails to see if they can have any DNA in those fingernails that would match the alleged defendant in this case.
The next day, on Friday, June 21st, there was a candlelight vigil to celebrate Jocelyn's life. It was the same day that we learned both suspects are illegal immigrants. Martinez-Rangel was arrested on March 14th, and Pena Ramos was arrested on May 28th. Both men were arrested near El Paso, Texas, and are originally from Venezuela. We also know that both of these men had previously been arrested in the weeks leading up to Jocelyn's murder. Because they are illegally in the country, how does that play into this case?
That's something we'd have to look at a little closer to see it in the context of all the evidence. You can't just presume because someone was on release for another offense, a nonviolent offense, that they caused a violent offense here. However, the very fact that they were on release, they had responsibility to report back to immigration, things of that nature, and they committed a crime, it's going to hurt them in that case as well.
On Monday, June 24th, Pena Ramos made his initial appearance in court, and the next day, on Tuesday, June 25th, Martinez-Rangel appeared. Earlier this week, both suspects made their initial appearance in court, and the district attorney asked the judge for a $1 million bond. But the judge returned a $10 million bond for each of the suspects, so I guess $20 million total. Are you surprised by that huge number?
No, not at all, because basically they're saying they shouldn't be out. They're a danger to the most importantly on the probable cause, they're a danger to the community. And even worse is they were on release for not being in this country legally for another violation of law, and now they gave at least enough evidence of probable cause to believe they committed this murder and rape.
To understand this bond better, we sat down with Nicole DeBordet, a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney based in the same city where Jocelyn was murdered.
So in Texas, which a lot of people find surprising unless the death penalty is on the table, a person is absolutely entitled to bond in a case. It doesn't have to be a low bond, but they're entitled to bond for a charge that doesn't involve the death penalty. And in this circumstance, you can imagine that the court will want to set a very high bond. But when you have an immigration issue on the side, these suspects, in other words, are thought to have violated immigration laws, even with a bond, even if these suspects were able to make the bond that the judge is forced by law to have to set, again, it will likely be very high. They probably would not be released anyway because they would have what we call an immigration hold, or they would be forced to remain in custody as the case is pending, because immigration also will want to ensure that these individuals do not leave to where they cannot be found and then answer to the court for these crimes.
So now they have this $10 million bond. Let's say magically they're able to pay this, but they're also now facing immigration holds because they had previously been arrested and had an offense there. How does all of that work? Are they just permanently on the immigration hold until it's investigated?
Well, that's what the immigration has to look at, and what their release was. We have to see from immigration. But yeah, just because they satisfy the one case doesn't mean they satisfy the other. They still have the hold on immigration, and immigration has to look back at where it's at.
According to lead prosecutor Megan Long, Martinez-Rangel actually researched leaving the U.S. after Jocelyn's murder.
The big difference was that we have gotten into Martinez-Rangel's phone and found evidence that he was searching for ways to leave the country once his image was released to the media.
Korubanek says this information could be brought in should the case go to trial, but it would take some legwork.
Items like this are very fact sensitive. So you have to put together more things to show that there's some sort of connection. You just can't randomly do it without some probable cause to be investigating, especially phones and things of that nature that have a lot of private facts and private information in them.
What about witness testimony? So I know that one of these suspects' neighbors came forward to investigators and said, yeah, he actually talked to me and said I did something bad. I'm planning to leave the country. Could that testimony be used?
Absolutely. That could be consciousness of guilt. It could be an admission. When you say something to someone who's not in law enforcement, it's not a Fifth Amendment kind of issue. And before you speak to law enforcement, you're advised of your Fifth Amendment right. Someone who just comes out and admits something to someone who's not in the investigation, or it could be used against you if you admit it to someone who is part of the investigation, but it's not as strong as a proof you have to have it admissible if you said it to your neighbor or someone who's not involved in the investigation.
But for now, as the investigation continues to pick up steam, both suspects are being held in the Harris County Detention Center. Obviously, investigators are taking meticulous notes and details, getting every bit of evidence that they can. For now, we have these two defendants who are being held. And I'm wondering, at that point, can investigators take their DNA? Because right now they're being detained, or do they still have to voluntarily give it over?
Yeah, I'm not sure on what exactly the criminal procedures are there, but I'm pretty sure that all they need is some probable cause. I mean, when you take body DNA testing, things like that, that's not a Fifth Amendment issue. You're not speaking. The Fifth Amendment is you don't speak in any way that can incriminate you. But if there's physical evidence and they could show probable cause, all they need is a court order, because they're just it's like fingerprints, things of that nature. So they're going to be taking bodily to see if there was sperm here. Did sperm match their DNA testing and things of that nature? And that would be very strong evidence for the government.
As far as the charges, DeBoard explains why the suspects were charged with capital murder.
So in Texas, capital murder, if there's an adult murder, but there are not other circumstances present, it may not rise to the level of being a capital murder. Capital murder in Texas usually requires, and it depends on the age of the victim, and in this case it was a child, which makes it fall into the capital murder category. But if it's an adult, I say just a murder, which is obviously the most horrific crime. It may not be a capital murder. And so you have different punishment ranges for different types of murder. So a murder in Texas that is not attached to, say, a robbery or to a sexual assault, those cases are prosecuted under a different punishment scheme and under a different statute. But because in this case, the complainant, the decedent, is a child, then what we're dealing with based on the statute is the capital murder statute, of course, which has a different punishment range.
At a press conference after the suspects' arrests, Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg told reporters if tests showed that Jocelyn was sexually assaulted, the suspects could face the death penalty.
Look forward to the results of the tests that are being run on the evidence in the case. And should those tests produce evidence that would support a charge of sexual assault, or should other evidence be brought forward that supports a charge of kidnapping, both underlying offenses would make this capital murder and these individuals death penalty eligible.
Just the crime itself, because the victim is 12 years old, it automatically means capital murder that both of these suspects are charged with. The DA down in Harris County said if there are more factors, we might move forward with the death penalty. One of the things they were talking about is sexual assault, and we've since learned that Jocelyn was sexually assaulted. So, what do you think is going through prosecutors' minds as they're determining whether they should move forward with the death penalty?
Well, how dangerous these defendants are to the public if they ever get out of jail, things of that nature. Will they be repeat offenders? And just quite frankly, I think the hardest thing they're looking at is the nature of the violence and the disrespect for life on so many different levels.
Prosecutors say it will be a while before they determine whether to seek the death penalty.
Make determinations about whether or not we're going to seek death very carefully. We have a committee. It is not a thumbs up or thumbs down decision by the elected DA like it used to be. I changed that. And the committee looks at the evidence, including evidence presented by the defense, especially if it has to do with mental illness or intellectual disability of any kind. We have to take that into consideration. And so it's a lengthy process to decide what is and is not an appropriate case to seek death on.
Meanwhile, the suspects are being charged as co-defendants, something Dort explains in more detail.
In state court in Texas, it is often unusual for defendants to be tried together because even though you see in many places, including federal court, oftentimes many co-defendants are tried during the same trial at the same time. The standards in Texas are a little bit different. The courts are very cautious, which really is a good thing. You want each person who is accused to be tried for their own conduct, their own involvement, not whatever lengthy criminal record your co-defendant might have, whatever other personal problems your co-defendant might have. You want to make sure that the person who's actually on trial is being tried for who they are and what they've done and not what somebody else may have done or who they were hanging around with. And so it's likely that even though they're co-defendants, that these trials will be had not at the same time, but one after the other.
We have these two men who are both charged with the same crime, but is it possible that one person might have done more than the other? Right now, they're co-defendants, but it's hard to say it was 50-50 between the two of them. Does that make things more complicated?
Well, it could also make things more easy for the government, quite frankly. And what I mean by that is if one of those persons were not involved at all, they were just hanging out and this all of a sudden happened unexpectedly to them, I'm pretty sure that they would be looking to the government and say, listen, I can tell you exactly what happened, but you've got to give me a better deal here. I'm not looking at a death penalty or life, but I could give you some information if it keeps me out of jail or things of that nature, or a lesser sentence, or I am innocent and I'm willing to cooperate with you because I had nothing to do with this. This got out of control and here's how. So it could be very beneficial to that person.
Going off that, do you think it's likely that these two suspects turn on each other?
It's always a potential that it could happen. You just don't know, though, if the one person, if both, we don't know if both people did it, but if, say, it was like we talked about hypothetically, one was the real person who committed everything, that other person may say, wait a minute, if I rat him out and give information, am I going to be safe? We don't know if there was connection here to organized crime, if they were here as part of a gang from another country or things of that nature. So it'll be interesting to see, but there's always that potential of having a cooperating witness.
Officials have already seen this a bit, saying P.A. Ramos told investigators it was Martinez-Rangel who tied up Jocelyn and was on top of her. It was apparently also Martinez-Rangel who suggested Jocelyn's body be thrown into the water to wash away some of the evidence. But even with this admission from P.A. Ramos, there is still time for both suspects to deny any involvement. We know the defendants are innocent until proven guilty. At this point, they've just been charged and are being held. But they're innocent until proven guilty. So if you are taking on their case and you're working to defend them, how do you combat such a violent charge?
Well, what you need to do is you need to see where the investigation goes. You need to sit in silence and see what the government can have in evidence, and will that evidence come to a place where it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Also, too, is you also have to take into consideration is, are they able to prove the murder charge? And if they're not, can they still prove lesser included offenses? Things of that nature. So it's a very difficult case for the defense because of the fact that it's not something that happened in the middle of the day where you could say, yeah, I was with her, I had sex with her, but then I left. I don't know who did this or that. These are the kind of things that I'm sure are going through investigators' minds, saying, all right, here's what we're focused on. We have no other people that we need to investigate here because there was nobody else around.
In this case, what would lesser charges potentially be?
Well, it could be rape. It could be something of that nature. It could be the conspiracy of rape, things of that nature. Could be assault. Who knows?
From here, Korobanic says there's still investigative work to be done. Where do you think the investigation is headed from here?
Well, I think right now it's going to be a lot of forensics that it's going to be going into. It's going to be, I think, some blood testing, things of that nature to see if defendants were under the influence of any sort of controlled dangerous substance, alcohol, things of that nature. If there's any DNA matches found on anyone's body, whether it's the victims or the defendants, if they have each other's DNA on the bodies, that sort of is a lot of stronger evidence for the government. It seems like a simple case because there's so little people involved, but it is complicated without direct witnesses. And when you don't have direct witnesses, you have to rely on the scientific forensic type of evidence.
A funeral for